My wife's grandfather was a man carved from a different kind of rock. We called him Pop, and by the time I met him in the late 60s, he was already stooped a little from a life of hard labor. His hands thick and calloused into permanent claws, perfect for gripping a throttle or a bottle of Iron City beer. He didn't talk much, especially not about the war. All we knew, the pieces we put together from my mother-in-law's hushed stories, was that he'd been a GI in Italy, got himself captured, and spent a miserable stretch in a POW camp. But the story didn't end there. He got out. Not liberated, mind you, he just left, walked out, lived off the land, and somehow found his way back to the Allied lines, where he picked up his rifle and got back to the business of finishing the fight. That was the core of him, I think, a quiet, stubborn refusal to be stopped. It's what made him a legend in our family, and as I would learn, a legend down at the Allegheny Steel Works too. After the war, he came home, married his sweetheart, and hired on at the mill, working the dinky engines on the plant's internal railroad. It wasn't glamorous. He wasn't barreling across the country for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His world was a 5-mile loop of track that wound through the smoke-belching cathedrals of the mill. He'd spent his shift shunting hopper cars full of coke to the blast furnaces, moving gondolas of raw steel, slabs from the rolling mill to the finishing plant, and hauling slag cars out to the reclamation pits. His locomotive was his kingdom, a grimy diesel-fumed throne from which he conducted the slow, heavy ballet of the mill's lifeblood. The mill was a city unto itself, cleaved in two by the Monongahela River. A skeletal, rust-colored rail bridge was its main artery, and Pop was the heart that pumped the blood cells of steel and coal and iron across it. The main tracks, the ones that served the whole operation, cut right through the plant yards, crossing the narrow asphalt roads that the foremen and executives used to get around in their company cars. When Pop had a long drag, say 30 or 40 cars of raw ore coming in, he'd block those crossings for 10, maybe 15 minutes. It was the law of the land. The train was a 2,000-ton god, and everyone else was just a mortal who had to wait. Most everyone understood this. It was the rhythm of the place, but the mid-60s were a time of change. New guys were coming up, college boys with slide rules and crisp white hard hats that had never seen a drop of grease. They talked about efficiency and time-motion studies. They didn't understand the rhythm. They only understood the ticking of a clock. The story, as it was told to me by one of Pop's old brakemen, took place on a blistering August afternoon. The air was thick enough to chew, tasting of sulfur and hot metal. Pop was pulling a long string of slag cars from the open hearth on the west side of the river, heading for the dump on the east. These cars were filled with glowing molten refuse, the devil's own soup, and you didn't rush them. You moved slow and steady, feeling the immense weight of them behind you, the couplers groaning with the strain. He was just starting across the bridge, the engine's yellow light flashing, the crossing bells clanging their lazy warning, when a brand new Ford Falcon squealed to a halt at the crossing. Behind the wheel was one of the new guys, a young efficiency expert named Davies. Davies was all of 25, with a sharp suit under his coveralls and a belief that his degree from Carnegie Tech gave him authority over men who had forgotten more about steel-making than he would ever know. Davies sat there for a minute, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as Pop's diesel locomotive crawled by at a walking pace. Then the first slag car came, radiating a heat you could feel even from 50 yards away. Then the second, the third, the fourth, each one trundling by with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a glacier. For a man like Davies, this was an unacceptable delay. He had a meeting. He had a clipboard. He had importance. He laid on the horn, a short, impatient bleat that was swallowed by the mill's roar. Pop, high up in his cab, didn't even flinch. He just kept his hand on the throttle, his eyes on the track ahead. The train kept moving. Davies, incensed, threw the Falcon in park and stormed out of the car. He marched up to the side of the tracks, his face red, and started waving his arms. "Hey, you in the engine, speed it up," he yelled, his voice thin against the rumble. Pop's brakeman, a guy named Sully, was riding on the running board of the engine. He just looked at Davies and shook his head. But Davies wasn't shouting at him. He was shouting at the man in the cab. Pop eased the throttle back another notch. The train slowed even more, the screech of the wheels dropping an octave. He leaned his head out the window, his face a mask of calm indifference. He didn't say a word. He just looked. I said, "Speed it up. I've got a meeting with the plant superintendent." Davies screamed, jabbing a finger toward the administration building on the other side of the tracks. You're holding up progress." That's when Pop did it. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell back. He just reached up and pulled the brake. Not an emergency stop, but a full hissing application. The entire 2,000-ton train groaned to a complete halt, the engine idling right in front of the fuming executive. The middle of the train was now parked squarely on the bridge, the end of it still, in the west yard, and the front of it blocking every road on the east side. He had, with one pull of a lever, completely paralyzed the entire steel mill. Silence descended, or what passed for it in that place. The roar of the converters and the clang of the rolling mills were still there, but the immediate, overwhelming presence of the train was now a dead, heavy stillness. Men stopped what they were doing and looked over. A crowd of hard hats started to gather. Pop killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. He reached down, picked up his battered metal lunch pail, and opened it. Then he pulled out a thermos, unscrewed the cap, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He leaned his arm on the open window frame, took a slow sip, and looked down at Mr. Davies. His voice when it came was low and gravelly, carrying easily in the strange quiet. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "this train is full of about 1,000 tons of 700-degree liquid rock. I've been driving it for 17 years. It moves at the speed it moves. You in your fancy car are going to wait. Or you can explain to the plant superintendent, Mr. Hennessy, who I happen to play poker with every other Friday, why my train is sitting right here, getting cold." He took another sip of coffee. "Progress," he added, almost as an afterthought, "ain't got a damn thing to do with it." Davies's face went from red to a pasty white. He looked from Pop's impassive face to the growing audience of smirking, grease-stained millwrights and laborers. He looked at the immense, unmoving wall of steel cars that now trapped him. He had no power here. His charts, his slide rule, his college degree, they were all meaningless against the sheer physical reality of the situation and the unshakable will of the man who controlled it. He had challenged a force of nature and lost. Without another word, Davies turned, stalked back to his Falcon, and sat there, defeated. Pop finished his coffee. He deliberately screwed the cap back on his thermos, placed it carefully back in his lunch pail, and snapped the lid shut. Then, and only then, did he fire the engine back to life. He released the brake, eased the throttle forward, and the train began to move again, at the exact same slow, steady, deliberate pace it had been moving before. He didn't look back. He just did his job, the way he always had. He'd faced down the Wehrmacht. A pipsqueak in a new car wasn't even a skirmish. It was just a pause for a coffee break. My wife told me that story a dozen times, and every time she'd end it with Pop getting the train moving again. To her, that was the victory. The slow, rumbling departure was the final triumphant note in a symphony of defiance, but it wasn't the end. In a place like that mill, a world of gears and steam and simmering resentments, an act like that doesn't just fade away with the diesel smoke. It creates ripples. The rest of Pop's run was uneventful, at least on the surface. He eased the massive torpedo cars into the basic oxygen furnace building, the air growing thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. He positioned each car with the precision of a surgeon, lining up the pouring spouts with the mouths of the giant crucibles below. From his cab he watched as colossal cranes hooked onto the cars, tilting them to spill their incandescent cargo. The roar was immense, the light so bright it hurt to look at, a man-made sunrise that turned the cavernous building into a vision of hell. This was the point. This was the job. 1,000 tons of liquid rock, delivered safely. A ballet of immense, dangerous machinery that relied on the steady hand and calm nerve of men like Pop. Progress, as he'd said, had damn little to do with the raw physics of it all. By the time he'd emptied the last car and was trundling the train back towards the engine house, he was already an hour and a half past the end of his shift. Charlie, his relief, was leaning against the switching shack, smoking. A cigarette, his face impassive in the glow of the yard lights. "Evening, Pop," Charlie said, taking a final drag and flicking the butt into the gravel. "Charlie," Pop nodded, climbing down from the cab, the steel steps groaning under his weight. "Heard you had a run-in with one of the college boys." News traveled fast along the rails and catwalks. Faster than any memo from the front office. Pop just grunted, retrieving his lunch pail. He was in a hurry. Charlie smirked. "They always are. Hennessy wants to see you. Sent a runner down an hour ago." Pop wasn't surprised. He'd known the coffee break wasn't the end of it. Davies was the kind of man who, when punched in the nose, didn't punch back. He ran to get his bigger brother, or in this case, the rule book. "All right," Pop said, his voice giving nothing away. He nodded to Charlie, who climbed up into the locomotive, the new king of the Little Steel Kingdom. The plant superintendent's office was in the main administration building, a place Pop had only been in a handful of times in his 17 years. It felt like a foreign country. The air didn't smell of coal smoke and hot metal. It smelled of floor wax and stale paper. Instead of the roar of the mill, there was the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Mr. Hennessy's office was at the end of the hall. The door was open. He was a big man, built like a retired linebacker gone a little soft in the middle, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of wood and left out in the rain. He was staring out the large window that overlooked the fiery expanse of the mill. Davies was there too, standing rigidly by the side of the desk, his arms crossed. He looked smug, like a boy who had finally tattled on the playground bully. "Frank," Hennessy said without turning around. He called Pop by his first name. Pop called him Mr. Hennessy. That was the way of things. "Mr. Hennessy," Pop said, stepping into the office. He held his lunch pail in one hand, his hat in the other. He didn't feel the need to sit. Hennessy finally turned, his eyes tired but sharp. He gestured with his chin towards Davies. "Mr. Davies here tells me you held up a pour for nearly 15 minutes today. Says you stopped the train dead on the tracks to, what was it?" He glanced at a piece of paper on his desk. "To enjoy a coffee break. And in doing so, you deliberately violated the company's new directive on overtime." Davies puffed out his chest slightly. "It was a clear act of insubordination, sir. A willful disregard for efficiency and company policy." Hennessy's gaze shifted to Pop. He didn't look angry. He looked interested, like a man watching a slow-motion chess match. "What do you have to say, Frank?" Pop took a slow breath. He wasn't a man for speeches. "Mr. Davies was trying to beat my train at the crossing. He was in a hurry. I had 1,000 tons of 700-degree steel behind me. My brakes are good, but they ain't magic. If I hadn't stopped when I did, I'd have either derailed trying to, stopped too fast, or I'd have turned his nice new car into a hubcap." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He seemed upset, agitated. An agitated man around that much hot metal is a hazard, so I stopped, let things cool down. His temper, my engine. Same difference. He looked Hennessy straight in the eye. The coffee was just to make sure they both had enough time to do it right. The train moves at the speed it moves. You know that, sir. Rushing it is how people get killed. Davies scoffed. "This is ridiculous. He's inventing a safety issue to cover for his laziness. He cost his company money today. My projections." Hennessy held up a hand, and Davies' mouth snapped shut. The superintendent leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. He steepled his fingers and looked from Davies' red, indignant face to Pop's calm, weathered one. "Projections," Hennessy said, the word tasting like something sour in his mouth. "Mr. Davies, your degree is in industrial engineering, is it not?" "Yes, sir." "Carnegie Tech, top 10% of my class?" "Impressive," Hennessy said, though his tone made it clear he was not impressed. "Frank, where did you get your degree?" Pop looked down at his grease-stained hands. 3rd Infantry Division. Mostly in France and Germany." Hennessy nodded slowly. "Right. So, Mr. Davies, your education taught you about ideal efficiency. Frank's taught him how to stay alive and keep the men around him alive when everything is trying to kill you. There's a difference." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The no overtime rule is an accounting measure, Davies. It's for the bean counters in Pittsburgh who have never seen the inside of a mill. It's a guideline. Safety is a law. It's the only law in this yard. Frank has been driving that engine for 17 years. In that time, he has had 0 safety incidents. 0. Do you know how rare that is? His train has never been late for a pour, and he has never spilled a single drop of product. Not one." He picked up the paper from his desk and held it up. "This report says he incurred 1 hour and 38 minutes of overtime. You know what I see? I see a man who prevented a multi-million-dollar accident, averted a potential fatality, and still got his job done. He identified a hazard, an impatient, inexperienced young man in a flimsy automobile, and neutralized it in the safest way possible. He tore the paper in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into his wastebasket. "Frank," he said, his voice back to normal, "you're docked 15 minutes pay for the unauthorized stop." Don't do it again. He gave the slightest of winks. Get on home to your family. Yes, sir, Pop said. He put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked out of the office, his work boots making a soft, steady rhythm on the polished floor. He never spoke of it again. To him, it wasn't a story about winning. It was just a day at work. But I think about it a lot. I think about that quiet moment of defiance, that steel-willed calm in the face of foolish, arrogant haste. It was more than just a man stopping a train. It was a lesson. It was a reminder that some things, experience, patience, a deep and abiding respect for the dangerous reality of the work, can't be measured on a chart or optimized by a slide rule. They're the things that keep the whole world from going off the rails. They move at the speed they move. And all the progress in the world ain't got a damn thing to do with it.